How happy are you? I'm a 3.7. That number came out of the Authentic Happiness Inventory, a short online test that you can take at the University of Pennsylvania Authentic Happiness website in the questionnaire center. The scale is out of 5, and my score surprised me. It was higher than I thought it would be. At the same time, the PANAS questionnaire, which measures positive and negative affect, came in with a positive affectivity of 30 out of 50, which puts me squarely in the average range. You're listening to Happiness and the Pursuit of the Good Life, a podcast about ancient wisdom, modern psychology, and the search for a life that is not only successful, but meaningful. I'm Michael Satlow. Today, how we measure happiness, what those measurements reveal, and what they quietly assume. My particular scores do not matter much, but the act of scoring does. This episode is about measurement. How do psychologists measure happiness, and what is at stake? How do sociologists measure collective happiness? And what's really behind and at stake in these measurement tools? The way we measure happiness does not just describe happiness, it shapes what we think happiness is. Trying to measure happiness requires first defining it with some precision. When we think about happiness, I think that most of us first consider our current and immediate emotions or affect. Affect, we all know, is extremely volatile. A bit of good news can make us very happy, whereas some bad news or simply a stray negative thought can send our mood diving. It is also extraordinarily subjective. The day I did the PANAS questionnaire, I slept lightly, skipped my workout, and did it at my office desk before a meeting that I was not looking forward to, while still needing to prepare for the class I was to teach later in the day. I have no doubt that it would change if the conditions were different. I spoke to someone recently who was telling me that he was basically a happy person, and yet he often felt like he was on the verge of exploding. To me, as an outsider, that didn't sound like a characteristic of a basically happy person. Yet I think that most of us can resonate with this paradoxical feeling, because we tend to lump together a whole complex of feelings under the umbrella term happiness. We can have difficulty articulating what we really feel. Think, for example, about how you feel in the following 9 situations. Eating your favorite decadent dessert. Eating your favorite decadent dessert to the point where you have a stomachache. Falling in love. Falling in love with someone who rejects you. Going for a walk on a beautiful day with your significant other. Thanksgiving dinner with your family. Losing track of time while reading a good book. Losing track of time while doom scrolling. Finishing a complex and challenging task. The list, of course, goes on, and not every one of these situations is going to leave you in a state that you might call happy. But still, you get the point. The way that we use the term happy is highly baggy and imprecise, and often covers a range of emotions that are not really the same. I can be generally content with my life, and yet often feel irritable or anxious. If I do so, am I actually happy? Psychologists have long wrestled with this problem. Researchers thus tend to distinguish between affect, immediate but fleeting emotions on either end of the spectrum, and overall life satisfaction, which includes things like a sense of purpose and meaning as well as our social connections. This combination of emotions is called the measure of subjective well-being, and there are many survey tools used to measure it, including the Authentic Happiness Inventory. In its simplest and easiest form, it is the answer to the question, overall, how satisfied are you with life as a whole these days, with a rating along some scale. Measures of affect will include questions such as, how happy were you yesterday? that one rates along the scale. In both cases, though, it is important to keep in mind the word subjective. A person's score rests entirely on how that individual perceives their emotions, and then how comfortable they are being honest in reporting them. I might have difficulty getting off the couch, often a symptom of depression, but report a moderately high degree of affect because I just finished watching a good TV episode. A ruthless person might report high life satisfaction because life is going well for him, even if his life is doing damage to others. For individuals, then, happiness is a difficult and sometimes confusing concept to really understand. It often makes it easier to avoid the term and think about our momentary affect, our sense of optimism or despair, the strength of our relationships, our engagement in what we do, and our sense of meaning and purpose, both in specific situations as well as more generally. At least then we know what we're dealing with. Definitional problem is compounded when we turn to thinking about groups. Every year, the World Happiness Report ranks the happiest countries. In partnership with the Gallup World Poll and many other agencies, the World Happiness Report uses state of the art techniques for assessing global happiness. According to their website, the basis for their assessment is the Cantrell ladder. The tool was developed in 1965 and has been applied by Gallup to representative populations in more than 150 countries. The ladder is a simple tool that considers the following four statements. Please imagine a ladder with steps numbered from 0 at the bottom to 10 at the top. The top of the ladder represents the best possible life for you, and the bottom of the ladder represents the worst possible life for you. On which step of the ladder would you say personally you feel you stand at this time? That's called the ladder present question. On what step do you think you will stand about 5 years from now? Which is called the ladder future question. The annual results are widely reported. To the amusement of many, Finland regularly comes up on top with a rating of about 7.7. In 2024, the United States comes in at a disappointing 23rd. Nevertheless, the World Happiness Report does demonstrate general correlations between a country's rank on this subjective measure and 6 other variables. These include GDP per capita, social support, healthy life expectancy, freedom, generosity, and corruption. Some of these measures are objective, while others also depend on subjective perceptions. The correlations are far from uniform. The United States, for example, has a GDP per capita that is more than 50% above that of Finland, while at the same time, the top countries in the survey all tend to have relatively high GDP per capita compared to the bottom half of the rankings. That said, it's really interesting to compare the United States to, say, Mexico. The United States has a GDP per capita in 2023 of about $74,000, with a life satisfaction score of 6.72. Mexico has a GDP per capita of about $22,000, far higher corruption than the U.S., a life expectancy of about 75 years, which is 2 years behind the U.S., and yet an almost identical life satisfaction score of 6.68. So what about happiness? Learn about happiness from such a report. One possible takeaway is that the tool itself is biased toward richer cultures. As one researcher writes at the conclusion of an analysis of the Cantrell ladder, we show how the phrasing and the framing of the Cantrell ladder influence individuals to consider power and wealth more and relationships less, compared to conditions excluding the ladder and reformulating the scale anchors. That is, the very metaphor of a ladder influences the way that respondents answer the questions. This is compounded by the language of the question itself, which might trigger certain issues of comparison. A second related issue, also raised by the comparison between the United States and Mexico, is the correlation between a feeling of subjective well being and the strength of relationships. Many of the higher scoring countries also have strong family networks, although, admittedly, many of the lower scoring countries do as well. Perhaps phrased differently, a survey instrument might better be able to capture this. Most interesting, though, is the assertion that Finland is the happiest country. Researchers have spent a good deal of effort trying to figure out why that is. The Finland finding is interesting enough to warrant a discussion. Generally, commentators have identified the following four aspects of Finnish society as contributing to happiness. First, extensive social support. High quality healthcare, education, childcare, all free or heavily subsidized, and unemployment and retirement benefits are all relatively generous. This greatly reduces some of the stressors found in other developed countries. The reduction of stress in these areas has an enormous trickle down effect. Second, but related to the first, is an ethos of equality. Taxation supports this extensive social support, but it is deployed in a highly progressive way that reduces income disparity. The Gini coefficient, which is used to measure income inequality, is about 29% in Finland, compared to around 49% in the United States. The top personal tax bracket is about 60%. Whatever the cause and effect, outside of tax policy, Finns tend toward more egalitarianism in social and business environment. It's an ethos that damps down competition while at the same time preserving a relatively high standard of living. Third, a culture that emphasizes access to nature. Given Finland's climate, this might seem paradoxical, but making it a priority to get into nature and enjoying the limited sun, even in the dead of winter, seems to increase well being. Fourth, and finally, there's a basket of cultural attitudes that range from social trust to optimism and gratitude. Having a positive outlook on life impacts one's experience of it. The last thing I want to do here is to glorify Finland as a model for us all. Like every country, Finland has a unique history, scale, geography, social structure. What is interesting to me, though, is the deliberate social planning and decision making that goes into optimizing happiness at the expense of limiting other potential goals, such as personal liberty and the ability to become exceedingly wealthy. Throughout this discussion, and generally through most public discussions of happiness, run a series of implicit assumptions. When made explicit, it becomes clearer that these assumptions are not always necessary or even helpful. Let's focus on four that I think are particularly important. First, that happiness is about the individual. Many of us live in a society that values the individual as an autonomous agent. The individual, for example, has the right to vote. This is not a right given to a larger social unit like the family, clan, or village elder. As we know, this has not always been the case. From the Enlightenment on, we have moved toward an increasing emphasis on the self. The emphasis goes far beyond how we vote or even our social policies. It has become an essential part of our culture. There is no self improvement industry without a prior assumption that the individual stands at the center and that there is a value to individual self improvement. So, it is also the individual who seeks happiness. On some level, this assumption is undoubtedly true. We experience emotions as individuals. At the same time, though, we recognize that the quest for individual happiness is not and has never been universal. For many people, at many times, the idea that I, as an individual, should pursue my own happiness, largely disconnected from my community, would have seemed quite odd. Thinking about this assumption brings to my mind the show Billions, and particularly the character Wendy. Wendy is a psychologist who works at a hedge fund. Her job is to help depressed and underperforming workers get back on their feet to make more money for the company. She essentially supplies psychological band aids to those who are deeply unhappy and trapped in an unhappy life and job. However common Wendy's actually are, the character is plausible. The show seeks to highlight the daily experience of many individuals who essentially find themselves leading unhappy lives that they're afraid to uproot. They like the money, excitement, and status, and only wish that they could have them without the negative baggage. This entire way of thinking relies on an assumption about what happiness is and where it is located. Not coincidentally, it is an assumption that also drives at least a couple of economic engines: the companies that create such unhappiness and those that apply the salves. Second, happiness is a right. The United States Declaration of Independence makes this claim, or more precisely, that you have a natural right to pursue happiness. This is a much weirder assumption. If this is a natural right that goes back to our earliest existence, wouldn't someone have realized it before the Enlightenment? Why is the individual pursuit of happiness not a privilege? The idea that we have such a right percolates down through our culture and informs much of our individual decision making. The question is not whether we actually have such a right, but whether believing that the pursuit of individual happiness, however we might subjectively define it, is more helpful or harmful to us, individually and collectively. From this question, one can run several thought experiments. Let's say, for example, that you replace the belief that you have a right to pursue happiness with the belief that you do not have such a right, but that you do have a duty to add to the happiness of members of your family. How might that impact your decisions and emotions? How many of our feelings of entitlement are rooted in the belief that such a right exists? And do these feelings actually add to or detract from our sense of well being? The third assumption is that happiness is something that can be pursued. It is certainly true that the various components that comprise happiness can be pursued. But can happiness itself be an object of pursuit? What would it look like to actually catch it? We can pursue pleasure, but that's a pursuit that is endless and can be sated only temporarily. We can seek a life of purpose and meaning, but that is an ongoing pursuit that can unravel in a moment. Our relationships give us great happiness, but sometimes they also bring us great pain, whether due to our own actions or the actions of others. I'll return in future podcasts to the key secret of happiness. It is better seen as a byproduct than a goal in itself. But I'll just leave it at that for now. And the fourth assumption behind the measurement of happiness is that it is normal to be happiness. I hate to break it to you, but there is nothing normal or natural about happiness. As a species, we develop the capacity to be happy. Our desire for positive affect drives us toward evolutionary goals, such as high caloric food, reproduction, and social ties. We may, and this is something we will explore in the next episode, have a natural drive for some form of contentment found in a life of purpose or meaning. It's also true that happiness might confer some selective advantage on individuals. We tend to like happier people more than morose ones, and let them ascend into positions that give them more access to resources. But for the most part, a regular state of happiness has little evolutionary advantage in our current conditions. Moreover, whatever happiness we have tends to be greatly overshadowed by our enormously developed capacity toward negativity. We are wired to worry because in the wild, our lives depended on caution and quickly reacting to danger. If our pleasure centers don't impel us to consume the entire buffalo leg, we might not live to eat again. To a certain degree, we can get by in life while depressed. If our negative systems don't warn us to worry about a noise that could be coming from a nearby tiger or member of an enemy tribe, we may not get a second chance. Two important corollaries here. First, and this is a relatively recent insight of psychologists, happiness and unhappiness are not two sides of the same coin or opposite ends of the spectrum of a psychological system. Rather, we have at least two systems acting independently. One controls our pleasure and happiness. The other controls our worry and anxiety. The latter usually overshadows the former, even in situations that are now far removed from the jungle. We worry about how people talk about us on social media because down deep, we're worried about being abandoned by the group and left to die alone and unprotected. We simulate all kinds of negative scenarios without even trying because we're wired to try to stay alive. At the same time, we can feel pleasure and contentment. This has often led me into a state of confusion. Why am I so anxious when I feel generally content with my life? And that leads to the second corollary of the assumption that it's normal to be happy, which is simply that it's not. Here I venture into the work of Russell Harris in his book, The Happiness Trap. I could, though, and will in a future episode, go further back into many religious teachings, especially Buddhism. Suffering is a more normal part of life than happiness. There are indeed ways to minimize internal psychological suffering and to increase happiness, but there is nothing normal or natural about doing either. There are certain therapeutic approaches that arise from this premise, such as acceptance and commitment therapy. But the realization of this problem and the development of responses to it are old indeed. The idea that we should expect to be happy arose in the modern era and has itself probably caused more suffering than happiness. It simply sets the bar too high. So this episode began with a number, 3.7. But the larger point is that happiness is never just a number. The way we measure happiness shapes what we think happiness is: a mood, a judgment, a social condition, a right, a pursuit, or perhaps a byproduct of something else. Next time, we turn from psychology to philosophy, and especially to Aristotle's idea of eudaimonia, a word often translated as happiness, but perhaps better understood as flourishing or the good life. Two questions to think about this week. Which matters more to you, pleasure or contentment? And if you had to choose, would you prefer a deeply content life with modest pleasures or a life filled with intense pleasures, but little underlying contentment? You're listening to Happiness and the Pursuit of the Good Life with me, Michael Satlow. Readings, resources, and ways to support the podcast are available in the show notes and at mlsatlow.com. I welcome your questions and feedback.